webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees, assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Good evening. Thank you, Kelly, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to call your attention to the slide on your screen advertising our 5th annual New Jersey Walks for TS event being held in Mendham, New Jersey on November 15th. Proceeds from the event will fund our educational outreach program. If participating in the walk is not possible, I urge you to log on to our website and make a donation in support of our educational programming. Now, without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Andrew Lee. Dr. Lee received his undergraduate degree in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and his doctorate in clinical psychology from the Rutgers University Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology in Piscataway, New Jersey. He is the director of the Office of Counseling and Disability Services at Kean University. His office oversees both the Kean University Counseling Center and the Kean Office of Disability Services. He's worked with a wide variety of age groups and ethnic populations throughout his career, but has particular expertise in working with Asian Americans. Dr. Lee specializes in working with Asian American young adults who are struggling with integrating two distinct worlds and multiple voices into a cohesive and satisfying personal experience. So without further introduction, I'm going to turn tonight's presentation over to Dr. Lee. Welcome to our webinar programming, Doctor, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Marty and Kelly, and I am so excited to be talking about this topic, and I hope that all of you find the talk interesting and informative. I have entitled the talk Mental Health Issues. Asians have those, and we'll be talking about a variety of different issues surrounding that. So let's get started. So by way of introduction, I wanted to start just really talking about the term Asian Americans. Really, is there such a thing? So when we talk about Asian Americans, what we're talking about is a combination of 43 different ethnic groups, or at least 43 different ethnic groups, and hundreds of different languages. So in terms of really talking tonight, the primary focus of tonight's talk is going to be on the Far East Asian groups, specifically Korean and Chinese Americans. So Southeast Asian Indians have a qualitative different history, and so their experience may differ. However, anecdotally, I will say that in terms of my experience with Southeast Asians, many of the things that we're talking about tonight also hold. So really, the question to start with is, why do we care? Why is this topic a topic that is even something to discuss? So one of the most important reasons is that minority individuals will make up eventually over 50% of the U.S. population by the year 2050, and Asians are one of the fastest growing minority populations. Obviously there are other ones, but Asians being one of them. And Korea has been one of the top 10 sources of immigration to the U.S. during the past 2 decades. And just for those that are in New Jersey, if we look at New Jersey census information, Asians represent 7.4 of the New Jersey population. However, nationally, they're about 4.4 of the population. So what's that mean? It means that there's lots of Asians in New Jersey. And if you've ever been to places where there are a lot of Asians, such as Edison or Parsippany or other places, you know this to be true. So now, if we talk more clinically, the reasons that we care is that between the ages of 25 and 34, Asian Americans have the highest proportion of suicide. And Korean Americans, specifically, are very likely to use substances to deal with emotional problems. And childhood Asian immigrants and U.S.-born Asians have greater risk for psychiatric disorders. So we can see that there are lots of clinical reasons why this population is an important one to think about and an important one to consider. And as the introduction stated, I am the director of a college counseling center. And in terms of talking about college counseling specifically for this population, Asians at Cornell, Asian and Asian Americans at Cornell, made up about 60%, so about 13 out of the 21 suicides since 1996 at Cornell. However, they are only 14% of the student body. So if you think about that statistic, 60% of the suicides, but only 14% of the student body. So we realize that, again, this is an important group to be focused on. So now let's start with this, Finding Nemo. So Finding Nemo is a movie, for those that don't know, that came out in 2003. So the question is, what does Finding Nemo, this movie, have to do with Asian American mental health issues? So if you think about it on the surface, how could the story of a little fish, this little fish that he has this adventure, how could that have anything to do with Asian American mental health issues? And the answer is, in fact, absolutely nothing. However, the thing that's important about Finding Nemo is this. So it came out in 2003. I will be giving away my age a little bit here. In 2003 is when I earned my doctorate. And so it came out right around the time when I was graduating. So my father and I, or actually my father had watched this movie. And I was home, and I was sitting with him and talking with him, and he said to me, son, I learned a lot about watching this movie. I thought, this is fantastic. Here I am a new psychologist understanding about individuation and development and really being able to grasp the psychological implications of this, about growth and all of that. And so what happened is that, so I asked my dad excitedly, I said, so Dad, okay, great, what did you learn? Like, what did you learn? Here I am, I'm thinking he's going to give me some amazing psychological insight. And what he says to me is this, he said, son, what I learned was, if Nemo had listened to his father, none of this would have happened. I threw my hands up in despair and realized this is what I'm dealing with. And that's the point. Right? That's the point. That's why I start with this, that even for a budding psychologist at the time, now a much more experienced psychologist, even that culture makes a difference. And that I think that's really an important story to highlight that. Also, so what I did is I also took a survey of Chinese American students. So these are Chinese American students. And we surveyed, or I surveyed them and asked them this very question. What would you like your parents to know? And these are the responses. So I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll read some that I think are pretty important. That learning is punishments and rewards. That only giving criticism does not work. That giving material things is not the only way to show love. That I don't need much money. I think the kid that said that one got beat up later on, but that's okay. And that I want more time and involvement from them. That when they compare me to others, it hurts. That's an important one that I want you to hold on to for later on in the webinar. That I need to hear you love me sometimes. And that America is not China, Korea, or Japan. And so if you look at this list and you think about this list, I mean, it's pretty poignant, some of the points that they're making here. Okay, so moving on, if we think about some common conflict points, when we're talking about the differences between Asian American children, for instance, and their parents, some of the points, one is really this obligation to family versus individual interests, specifically when it comes to college. Right? Because, again, that is one of my areas of expertise, and it's really about this sense that there is a tremendous amount of freedom that is afforded by going to college. However, with that freedom, there are these conflicting messages between family and between what they're hearing from their college peers. I think that conflict is really important, both internally and just interpersonally in terms of their family. There is this sense of responsibility for meeting parental expectations. So you see on the slide it says choice of college major. So I tried to use Google Translate to translate the word anthropology from English into Korean. And the result was, what are you, nuts? Obviously a joke. But no, but the point being is that those are things like, how does that even translate? How does that translate from English into Korean? Is that even something that's acceptable in terms of a college major? Choice of attending college, can you say no? Is that something that is not done? Choice of future profession. Of course you have choices, right? Of course Asian Americans have choices for future professions. You can either be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. How many choices do you actually need, right? And obviously choice of romantic partners. So again, this whole sense of who gets to choose, whose life is it? I think that is a very important conflict point that happens. And again, this whole notion of emotions and talking about emotions. I think one of the quotes that I heard is that Asian parents deal with stomach aches and headaches, but they don't deal with feelings. When I talked to the group of Chinese American students that had done the list on the previous slide, and I said to them this question: what if your parents said to you, or have your parents ever said to you, I think you're feeling sad today? All of them, I think to a person, burst out laughing because they found it so incredulous to even consider and think that that is something that would be said. So again, very, very important to note. So in addition, there are a number of language issues that come into play when we talk about Asian American development. So there are language gaps often between more acculturated children and less acculturated parents, and I'll talk about acculturation later on in today's webinar, or tonight's webinar. So again, this power struggle for independence and authority, going back to the Finding Nemo story, I think that's really a lot of what Finding Nemo is about, this sense of independence, this developing independence. Now, I think it's also important to understand cultural differences in communication patterns and styles. So I want to talk briefly now about high context versus low context communication. So in terms of high context communication styles, you can think of that in terms of Asian cultures. So really context is incredibly vital to communication. So, and what context is and how that develops is from a long-term relationship. The only way that you know, not the only, but one of the more important ways that you know what is being said is not through the actual words. That it's not the coded, explicit, transmitted message, but rather it's about the physical context, the nonverbal cues, the history that you have with this person, how they say it. So again, that only develops in relationship, in understanding what their communication style is, what they actually mean by what they're saying. There are very strong boundaries between who understands that and who doesn't. And that's really important to know. Now, we contrast that with low context communication styles. And low context communication is really from Western culture, right? So the context, relationship, not so important. What's important is really the actual words that are spoken, the actual verbal communication that happens. It's very rule-oriented and it's very task-centered. So compare and contrast those two things. High context, nonverbal versus low context, very verbal, and context is almost irrelevant. In addition to that, in terms of communication style, there are differing levels of eye contact. And I think that plays out in a lot of ways because from a Western perspective, not having a lot of eye contact can be seen as defensive, it can be seen as evasive, or signifying some kind of social problems. But in fact, it actually could be quite the opposite, that it can be very adaptive and culturally congruent for someone from Korean, Chinese culture because culturally, that's not something that is done in terms of engaging in long-standing eye contact. So I think that's just an important piece to remember. And also, especially when it comes to language issues, is this discomfort with direct confrontation or openly disagreeing with someone, especially someone in authority. So for those educators that are in the audience this evening, this sense, at least as an educator, I want my students to be able to openly discuss, challenge, question me about things that are in the text or things that are in the material. And I want that because then it makes me understand or know that they're really engaged, that they're really thinking about all of this and all of that. However, I think it's important that we should be considering if what we're asking in terms of that is really hindered by their culture, and that it's not a lack of understanding or not a lack of anything about the material, but rather it's really a culturally congruent activity that they're engaging in by not disagreeing openly and by not confronting. Okay. So this is a picture. This next slide is a picture of, as you can tell from the top, South Korea in the 1970s. Okay. Now, and it's amazing that it looks like I was able to almost get the exact same picture, but it is not the same picture. But this picture is from South Korea in 2014. So you can see the vast difference between those two. They started building in color, which is really helpful. Again, a joke. But so you can see that it's incredibly different. And why do I do this? Why do I show you the differences between 1970s Korea and 2014 Korea? Because really we're talking about immigration. And I think that the important piece to that is that when people immigrate, especially for the parents may represent an earlier manifestation of that culture. So the parents, I can speak for myself, my parents, in essence, they represented what they knew was 1970s Korea. They believe, I don't know if they truly believe this, but I think they believe that really even 2014 Korea is still 1970s South Korea. And I think that's an important piece because even as the buildings and the development has happened in terms of the infrastructure, development has also occurred in terms of the culture. However, they're stuck in the culture of the past, not the culture of today. And I think that's an important piece to remember when we're talking with families that are Asian and Asian American. Again, this concept of parachute children and astronaut parents, for those that don't know, parachute children are when families will send their kids to the U.S. to study with the intention of joining their children later, kind of throwing them out of the airplane with the parachute. And then astronaut parents are ones who immigrate to the U.S. and then go back and forth between the U.S. and their country of origin. And that happens. And again, what's the impact in terms of the connection between their children? What's the impact in terms of culture and all of that? Again, in terms of immigration, there is this intense pressure that happens that is placed on the children because they're reminded oftentimes that they're the reasons the parents immigrated. So because of that, what can develop are these unrealistic expectations for the kids, that parents, what they want is they want more for their children than they had. That's one of the reasons, I think, almost to a person, that parents immigrate here. However, the point being for that is that they want more for their children despite what their children want or need. That oftentimes that's not something that is considered what the children want, but rather just what they believe. And again, because of this immigration process, role reversals can occur. There are these parentified immigrant children that occur because of that, because they acculturate, because they learn the language. There is a lot of differences, role reversals that happen due to that. Okay, so now I want to spend some time talking about Asian cultural values. And hopefully this will give you some greater insights into how culture really impacts Asian American children today. So really when we're talking about Confucianism and Asian cultural values, the first and foremost point to think about is this hierarchical family unit. There is a very distinct social structure when it comes to Asian and Asian Americans. So what happens is that the important thing is that there is interpersonal harmony through group focus, so that how you maintain connectedness is through this focus on the group, not necessarily focus on the individual. So this next point about mirroring. Mirroring is the process that mothers go through that, not always mothers, but the study is with mothers, so that mothers go through in terms of infants and little children, that it's what is encouraged, what is responded to. So a researcher by the name of Roland, he studied Japanese mothers and American mothers. And what he found, that Japanese mothers tended to mirror the child's interdependence, so things that they did that showed interdependence and respect for other people's feelings and needs. So what he found, or what he understood that to mean, was that the child learns to actively anticipate and meet the needs of others rather than focused on themselves. And American mothers, in contrast, mirrored the children's acts of asserting individual thoughts and wishes and actively expressing them, so that the self and the other are clearly separate. The emphasis is on autonomy, self-expression, and equal status, not necessarily this interdependence and respect for others. So again, an important difference between Asian and Eastern and Western cultures. So now I want to talk a little bit about the warrior father-son complex as compared with the Oedipus complex. So Oedipus, for those that don't know, it's a Greek myth about this man who eventually kills his father, kind of unbeknownst to him, sleeps with his mother, and then once he finds out that this is actually the case, then he goes out and he blinds himself, and I don't know what happens after that. But let me contrast that story with this warrior father-son complex, and this is taken from an article from '91 from Mei Tong. So a famous warrior leaves his pregnant wife to conduct a distant campaign for his emperor. He is away for 18 years. On his return journey home, he meets a young man to whom he loses a marksmanship competition. The warrior immediately drives an arrow into the young man's heart, killing him, because no one is supposed to be superior to the warrior. The young man, it transpires, is his son, whom he had never seen before. So now here's the difference. The warrior justifies his act by asserting that the son had violated his cultural role, first by not recognizing his father, then by daring to defeat him. So you can see from that story, without exception, role distinctions must be adhered to at all times. Very, very important, the sense of role, the sense of distinct social structure. Okay? Again, just going along with that, what is the role of the individual? The role of the individual is to create this interpersonal harmony. So that in order to do that, you need to know where you are in one's place in the society, that the duty is to the group, that there is an incredible filial piety. So that word really means love and respect for one's family and ancestors, and that dependence on the other is what creates this psychosocial homeostasis, this balance within the family. How that develops is this dependence, interdependence on the other rather than independence on the self. One way to think about these Asian cultural values is to think about how people introduce themselves. So Westerners, people in America, if you have an Uncle Joe or a Sam, Uncle Sam, that's how you would introduce your Uncle Joe or your Uncle Sam. You'd say, hi, this is my Uncle Joe, or this is Sam, or this is Fred. Asians, however, it's different for Asians. There are these complex kinship names, so they rarely use informal first names. What they say is, in essence, what they'll say is, hello, this is my father's older brother. So that there are these complex names given for roles in the family. Notice it's about role. It's not about the person, it's about their role in the family. And what's interesting is that there are differences in terms of kinship names for older brother to a boy, a younger sister to a girl, younger sister to a boy, not just older or younger brother, as we might say here in America. So that complex kinship name defines your role in connection. I think that is really telling and really important to consider when we think about this distinct social structure again, this hierarchy, because it is all about hierarchy. Where do I fall in that hierarchy? In addition to that, there is this sometimes hiding or really disavowal of strong feelings. So there's a lot of emotional restraint. Self-control is very valued. In terms of parents, they may not show very much affection in terms of physical affection. They may not show much affection in terms of verbal affection. However, what they do is that they may express their feelings of pride indirectly by telling friends or relatives about the achievements of their children. So they may talk about how great their kids are doing, but not to the kids. They will tell their sister, their brother, their family members, their friends, yeah, my kid's doing this, my kid's doing that, but they won't tell the kids. And that, I think, is one of the issues that occurs when we think about the differences, again, between parents and children. And again, if we think back to that slide about what the kids really wanted their parents to know, one of them said, when you compare me to others, it hurts. But yet this is the way that they show pride, and they show their affection and feelings. So again, that disconnect, that difference is really important. Again, there is this highly attuned social sensitivity that should be pretty obvious. And one of the problems can be misreading social cues. As an example, so there's an Asian American teenager walking the hallway in the school. She sees a friend. The friend thinks that this Asian American student is engaged in a conversation, and they walk by without saying hi. So the Asian American student feels dismissed and then questions if something is wrong with the friendship because of that misreading of social cues, when really the other friend was just trying to be nice and just trying to be polite. And again, this whole sense of achievement and success. So this is really important when it comes to why, right? Again, if we compare the differences between Asian culture and American culture, achievement and success is stressed to improve the family name, not necessarily to improve one's own social standing. Obviously, that is part of it, but really the point is, if you do well, then our name improves. So again, this whole issue of faith, social comparison, and that children really are seen as extensions of their parents. So if they do well, then that automatically assumes that the parenting was good. And if they don't do well, then it assumes that the parents were bad. And so that's really, really important. And finally, this whole sense of shame and guilt. Now, I know that Asian Americans are not the only ones that have the stock in shame and guilt. I know plenty of other ethnic groups that use that. I think Jewish families would agree that that is something that happens quite often. But it is something that is very important for Asians, this sense of shame and guilt. And they use that as motivation at times. So now I'm going to talk more specifically about some Korean cultural concepts. The sense of jip-an, so jip meaning house, and the concept is really within the house. So there is, again, this clear delineation between who's in the house and who's out of the house. So in I guess olden times, Koreans, how they built their homes was that there was this external courtyard, if you will, and then there was a gate. And if you were allowed in the gate, then that means you were in the house, even though you weren't, say, physically in the home, but that was considered part of the house. So in that way, again, this clear delineation because of these gates, who's in and who's out. You can think about that in terms of both the physical, but also the metaphorical and the emotional. I'm going to talk now about this concept. You can read the other ones about Jung and Nunchi, but this sense of bunsu, this acceptance of one's place in the social hierarchy with minimal resistance. So really, when we talk about Asian culture, Korean culture, societally, it actually may be that suffering and working hard for Asian and Asian Americans may be seen as a cultural paradigm or a way of life. So there is an old Chinese proverb that says, "No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich." So if you think about that, rising before dawn 360 days a year, that's the belief. That's what is valued. So that's an important piece to remember when we talk about, again, the differences. And again, this sense of chimyon, this face-saving or protecting the honor of the individual and the family. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about acculturation. This slide, for those that are following along in their handout, actually comes along later in the handout. However, I did move it up because I felt like it fit better here rather than later on in the talk. So you can flip a few pages and just look for this slide if you are taking notes. So this sense of acculturation and ethnic identity. So there really is not a agreed upon definition for either term. We could have a day-long discussion about how the terms are different, and I'll agree with you. However, just for the sake of today, we'll just use them interchangeably. So really, what is it? What is ethnic identity and what is acculturation? So you can read is ethnic identity is really this person's sense of belonging with other members of the ethnic group. When is that formed? It's formed during the interaction between that ethnic group and the dominant culture. And the gradual change that occurs during this contact is acculturation. So ethnic identity is really comprised of customs, beliefs, understanding of behavioral norms, and expectations. And it is important to consider and know that ethnic identity is a dynamic process, and it is situationally dependent. It is impacted by many factors, including racism, family history. So I'm going to talk about 4 different types of ethnic identities. The first is the traditionalist. Those are those people or individuals who identify strongly with Asian culture to the exclusion or almost exclusion of the dominant culture. So independent thought and action is overshadowed by this interdependent responsibility to the family, to the culture. Then we move to the assimilationalists. Those are the ones who value American identity to the exclusion of their Asian backgrounds. So they're the ones that would be flipped from the traditionalists. They view their own ethnic group unfavorably. There is this racial self-hatred that occurs. They may even deny the impact of racism. Then there's the marginal group. They feel alienated from both cultures. They feel like they really don't fit anywhere. And then there is this sense of bicultural ethnic identity, the sense of Asian American. So if we think about Asian American and this concept of living in the hyphen, so Asian American, Asian hyphen American, and this sense of living in the hyphen, that's really what we talk about when we talk about bicultural ethnic identity. It's an integration between both sides of their identity, the Asian and the American. Now, again, this is not a linear process. This is something that can move. You can flip from traditionalist to marginal to assimilationalist to bicultural. I would posit that most people, when they hit bicultural, they do feel that's a bit more consistent, but not always. Okay. So now let's talk about Asian Americans as the model minority. So for those that don't know what I'm talking about, the model minority is this belief that Asian Americans are a minority that have, quote unquote, made it in America and are immune to stresses of minority status. So those that buy into this belief, they use 4 different pieces of information. And the first is that there are disproportionately high levels of educational achievement for Asian Americans. So you can see in the slide that 42% of Asian Americans hold at least a BA. 10% of Harvard students are Asian Americans, 22% at Berkeley, 19% at MIT, 19% at UPenn. And for those of you that, do you know what MIT stands for? I know many of you are thinking Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You'd actually be incorrect. It's actually made in Taiwan. And then we look at the other one, 71% at Hawaii, 56% at Irvine, 38% at UCLA. And again, UCLA, what does that stand for? University of California of Los Angeles or at Los Angeles? Again, incorrect. University of Caucasians, lost among Asians. So you see the point, right? That there are lots of Asians at these schools. And so that's one of the points that people use when they talk about Asian Americans as a model minority. Then they also use this occupational success, so that Asian Americans have a higher household median income than other ethnic groups, that there are social indicators, that there's this high incidence of intermarriage between Asian Americans and whites, which I find an interesting statistic and also just an interesting indicator that they would use, and low rates of mental illness and underutilization of mental health services. So that's the model minority. So is that really true? In fact, when we look a bit closer, it's not, right? That there are large numbers of Asian Americans who are uneducated or undereducated, and proportionately larger than other majority and ethnic minority groups. So when we think about a Chinatown, if you think about the experience, if you've ever been to a Chinatown in New York or elsewhere, what that looks like, that there is a high prevalence of poverty. But those are not necessarily captured when we think about the educational achievement. And now when we think about this occupational success, this median income being higher than in the family, that oftentimes there's more than one wage earner in the family, oftentimes two, if not three or more. And again, if we look statistically, there are fewer than 1% of college presidents who are Asian American, Asian or Asian American. So when we look at the social indicators, that there still is a large anti-Asian sentiment that still exists. There are often hate crimes that still occur. And that these use of official statistics don't always work. Because again, if we think about going back to this whole sense of Asian cultural values and this interdependence and this carrying on or improving the family name, individual failure as a reflection of on the entire family, who's going to talk about that? No one. So in terms of official statistics, that might not be the best gauge. And when we think about this low rates of mental illness point, that Asian Americans may present at PCP meaning primary care physician, so at their general practitioner with somatic complaints, body complaints, rather than psychological issues. So they take that to mean, well, no mental illness concerns exist. No, that's not true. It's just that they are expressing their mental illness or mental issues through their body rather than through what we would typically think of as mental illness terms like depression or anxiety. So I hope you can see that really this model minority myth doesn't exist or is not true. For the educators out there and for those that have read this book, or at least heard about this book, I think it's been pretty popular. This book called The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother by Amy Chua. Amy is a professor at Yale University, I think a law professor at Yale. So in this book, she talks about things that she did not allow her two girls to do. She has two children, I think now they're 18 or even beyond that, that they were never allowed to attend a sleepover, never allowed to get less than an A, never allowed to watch TV or play video games, and never allowed not to play the piano or violin. So her entire concept or belief is that tenacious practice is crucial for excellence, and that she has and holds this entirely different parenting model. So you expect the best and you don't settle for anything less. And one of the quotes in her book is that all decent parents want to do what's best for their children. The Chinese just have a totally different idea of how to do that. And she posits maybe better idea. Now, the point that I have with this, or the issue that I have with this book, is that just because something seems to work, because actually her kids are very, very accomplished. I think they are both concert-level pianists, violin players. Just because something seems to work doesn't mean that it doesn't have another impact, and I think that is an important piece to consider. However, on the flip of that, just because it's something we don't like, we don't agree with, doesn't mean that it's wrong. So there is a balance here. I think when we look and read about Amy Chua and kind of her parenting strategies and all of that, we kind of instantly go to, wow, that is completely inaccurate, it's something we shouldn't do, it's damaging in some way. But I think it's oftentimes a bit, don't be so quick to judge in terms of parenting styles and things along those lines. So we do need to understand, again, culturally, where people are coming from. So it is important, however, to ask yourselves the question, what are you doing for the good of your child, and what are you doing for your own good? So this is really a question for parents. And really thinking about if and how you communicate with your children. What do you ask about? How do you ask about those things? However, I will agree that it is important to allow children this mastery experiences, this sense of tenacious practice, really being able to show them that they're capable of overcoming adversity and achieving their goals. But thinking about in terms of praise, I think that's another important piece that comes from this book. What is important to praise? Do you praise the ability or do you praise the effort? Do you say things like, you worked very hard at this, versus you must be really smart? And research has shown that when someone says something like, you must be really smart, oftentimes the child is not willing to take on harder tasks because they don't want to expose those deficiencies and challenge that belief. So it is important to understand what we're praising. That's both important for parents and also important for educators. And also, in complete fairness to Amy, subsequent articles have shown, and she's admitted, that Amy was actually a bit less strict and willing to compromise more than she might have demonstrated in her text, and I think that's really important. However, I would say that there is this hyper-focus on performance. When it comes to Asian and Asian Americans, this is really, really important, and the impact is really important. So Asian Americans, just some statistics, have been shown to spend twice as much time on academics as non-Asians. And teachers will sometimes say you can't be struggling because you're Asian. And Asian Americans report the greatest fear of academic failure. So they don't really have time for this whole sense of your own well-being. Who has time for that? Because I don't want to fail, or I can't fail. And even this whole concept of failing, what it means. So I don't know for those in the audience that know about the Asian grading scale. If not, I'll give it to you. So A is average, B is bad, C is a catastrophe, D is disowned, and F is forever forgotten. And obviously an overstatement, however, not so much. And this concept of fail versus Asian fail, which is anything below 98%. So again, now I'm talking about first-generation students, college students, who really have this experience of navigating the system on their own. So they have all of these very high expectations on them. So the question they may ask themselves is, if I don't fulfill these expectations, what am I? Who am I? And the flip. And what if I do? They may feel guilty actually surpassing their parents, even though that's what their parents want for them. And that is a very interesting conundrum for the student. If I don't do enough, if I do too much, both of those seem bad in some way. And I think that's really important to consider and to think about. So my personal experience suggests that this focus on performance is really the central issue for all of the Asian American students I've worked with, and what it means in terms of self-concept, self-esteem, what it means in terms of one's view of value, one's own contribution to society, to the family, that this sense of performance is incredibly important, and I think oftentimes overstated, to then impact their levels of depression, their levels of anxiety, and the like. So, and please, if there are any questions, please feel free to write them in the box, and I'll try to address them at the end. Now let's talk a little bit about this underutilization of mental health services by Asian Americans and why it might be. So the first is that truly their perception that mental health services are unrelated to their needs. So that it's really not about being depressed. It's not about being anxious. It's not about any of that. But rather, it's about these physical symptoms. So it's about being tired. It's about stomach aches. It's about a headache. It has absolutely nothing to do with these mental health issues. But now really the question is, do physical symptoms cause anxiety, or does anxiety result in physical symptoms? Chicken or egg? Another reason why Asian Americans might underutilize mental health services is that there is a stigma and a view that therapy is really for crazy people. You got to be nuts to go into therapy. And again, Asians are not the only ones that hold this view, but they hold it very strongly. There are some other issues that the therapists are untrained in culturally sensitive models, and that there are few therapists of similar racial and ethnic backgrounds. So really the implicit assumption is, if you look like me, you know me. It may not be true, but at least that's the implicit assumption. And if there aren't that many people that look like me, then maybe there aren't that many people that really understand what I'm going through. So why utilize those services? And one other statistic that is interesting is that Asian Americans may present for treatment with the greatest level of symptom severity compared with other groups. And one of the statistics has been that Asian Americans will generally wait on average 5.3 years after the onset of symptoms to seek mental health assistance, as opposed to about 2.5 years for Caucasians, so more than double. So that is why they have greater levels of symptom severity, because they're waiting longer. If you wait longer, things get worse. That is generally the rule. And so that's why one of the reasons why their symptom severity is so high when they seek treatment. Now, there is at least one positive reason why Asian Americans may underutilize mental health services, which is that they actually may seek help from non-professionals, family, community members, social, religious groups, pastors, and the like. So in that way, that's one of the positive things and positive reasons why they may underutilize. Now, a brief plug for what I do in terms of college counseling centers. So in terms of Asian Americans and college counseling centers, they actually may overutilize campus college counseling centers. Again, there are these conflicting messages. However, college really has, and this is one of the reasons why, college may be one of the first opportunities that they have for, again, this independence, freedom, independent thought, being able to do what they want, all of that. In addition, it's the first time that they're really able to ask themselves the questions and get the answers to, am I not feeling so great? What's going on? Why is this going on? So again, they may overutilize campus college counseling centers. And at Rutgers, this was shown to be true. So over 20% of Asian American students utilized services, even though there were less than 18% of the population. Again, not much of a difference, but still, and more than their respective percentage. And so we can see that they utilize these services. Why? Because, again, this emphasis that's placed on academic achievement, and we often can convince students to come to therapy by telling them, because it is true, by coming to therapy, you actually might do better in your classes because you might be less anxious, less depressed, the impact of family issues might be less, you may be able to study more, and all of that. So in fact, there is a positive impact that can happen. And so because of that, that can be the hook that drives people, Asian Americans, to come into therapy. And when they come, we see that there are very high rates of depression for Filipino and Korean Americans. And again, just going along with the Rutgers study, there is another study at UC Berkeley where UC Berkeley Asian American graduate students, they were asked about services and mental health services, and 75% indicated that they were aware of services, 50% considered receiving services, and 31% actually utilize the service. Now, if we think about the difference between 75 and 31%, not so great. However, if we think about that there were still 31% of the population that actually utilized services, that's really good. And you can see that's why I think it's so important to have college counseling centers. That's why it's so important to be able to reach out to these populations. So now let's talk a little bit as to what do I do? How do I work with these Asian American students? What do I do? Okay, so the first is this importance of jipan, this importance of understanding that you may only get certain information when you are perceived to be within the house. So how you develop that connection, and again, about the high context and low context communication. High context only develops through relationships. So it's about starting those relationships, developing those relationships. That's really, really important. So it's important also to convey a willingness to discuss issues surrounding race and culture and being able and open to discussing both of those pieces. Understanding that there is a clash between mainstream American cultural values and Asian cultural values. Again, this whole sense of interdependence versus independence, this sense of the we versus the me, so this collectivistic culture versus this individualistic culture. And I think, again, understanding that difference, that where they're coming from is this perspective of it's important for us, not it's important for me. And again, that is very, very different than a Western philosophy, or than someone coming from a more American kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be independent, get things done on your own. That is really, really important. So consider your own preconceptions about a client's race. I think it is really, really important to directly ask how a client, how a person, not only a client, identifies their race and ethnicity. So now imagine a person, this is for the therapists out there, imagine a person who looks Asian American coming into your office for therapy and or medication. So think about the preconceptions you might have about this individual. Again, hopefully information that you were informed about by things you learned from this talk. So things about collectivistic culture, things about this focus on the family, hierarchical structure, all of those things. Now imagine that you learn that this individual was adopted at birth by a Caucasian family. Would that influence your perception or picture of this individual? Absolutely. If it doesn't, then there's something wrong with you. Would you have known about that if you had not asked directly about how this person identifies their race or asked about their racial or ethnic history? No way. So that's why it's so important to ask. You know, sometimes it may feel inappropriate, sometimes it may feel intrusive, but it is really important that you ask that question to get to know them. Again, it's about relationship. It's about developing that relationship with that person. So this sense of we may look alike, but we are not the same. So even though tonight's talk was about Asian culture very generally, that does not mean that all Asian cultural groups are the same. Again, I've talked about the Southeast Asian differences or possible differences, but even within Far East Asian groups, Koreans may be different than Japanese, Japanese different than Chinese, that all of these groups have different cultural understandings, cultural backgrounds, and all of that. Okay, so it is important, again, to understand that difference. So even when you're talking about Asian or Far East Asian, that even within that there's heterogeneity. There's not this homogeneous grouping. Okay, so that's really, really important. And again, this concept of white privilege. So for those that don't know, white privilege is this set of advantages that are automatically afforded to members of a dominant culture. Things like being assured that if you go out, that there will be someone of your culture that is out with you. That if you look at mainstream U.S. films and TV, how many Asian or Asian Americans do you see? And I think there's a few more now. But, I mean, in the past, there was really pretty much Jackie Chan, Jet Li, things like that. And to think about that message. And again, when we're talking about white privilege, even those things that we're sometimes unaware of, and that's really important to consider. So now for the teachers and clinicians in the audience. So how do you work with Asian and Asian American students? So one of the tips that I might suggest is to consider your placement of tests during the week. This is obviously for teachers, to maybe not place all of your tests on one day. And again, your Asian American students did not actually pay me to give this advice. I actually think that it's a good idea and to decrease possible homework, because it eases the pressure. And again, we're talking about incredible amounts of pressure when it comes to Asian American families. Think about the tiger moms, right? The tiger dads. That it is a lot of pressure, that oftentimes there are these unrealistic expectations, and to know that. Consider the type of assignments that you ask. So again, when we consider the difficulty or the likelihood that Asians may not necessarily disagree openly, or they may not challenge openly. So really consider the type of assignments that you're giving and what you're asking them to do, and how this might fly in the face of their culture. Another possible suggestion is for teachers to have some parent education nights to increase awareness about Asian American issues and the interplay with those issues and the educational system. And I'm just so happen to may know someone that might be able to give a talk like that. So, if you're interested, I might be able to give you that person's information at the end of tonight's talk. Very shameless self-promotion. So also, finally, to really be careful not to suggest blame, even indirectly. And what I mean by that in terms of blame of the parents, or blame, because if the parents are feeling any sense of blame, that they will retreat, because they are going to feel this need to defend. And obviously many parents feel that, but especially for Asian American parents, they will feel this need to defend. And then really for clinicians out there, to really educate clients to the process of therapy, obstacles, outcomes of treatment, what really to expect, to give them the understanding of what to expect, that just understand and know that the teacher and the therapist is perceived as the expert authority, so that, again, challenging may not really happen. And really, for the clinicians out there, what is your definition of healthy psychological functioning? This concept of true self versus false self, I think that's really important to understand. What is abnormal in comparison to what? What is psychopathological as opposed to what? These terms are not culture-free, but embedded in a social cultural perspective and context. So what might be seen abnormal in Eastern culture might be seen as normal in Western culture, and vice versa. Okay. So with that being said, I want to open the time up now for some questions and answers. I know we don't have much time, and I do apologize for that.
All right, Doctor, thank you. I am going to launch right into some questions that have been posted. This first question is a little long, and it looks like it has two parts, so I may break it down a little bit. But the question has to do with clinicians. So how should clinicians who are trained in verbal psychotherapy approach Asian American parents who do not believe in the value of verbalization of problems? The comment is that most Western therapists will attempt to change parent values by asking them to speak about their issues, which is contrary. So could you talk about how a clinician could be trained in that area?
Sure. So, if I'm hearing the question correctly, so it is, how does a Western-trained clinician, someone who values kind of verbal expression, talk with Asian parents who may not value that so much?
Yes.
Is that the
Yeah,
question?
or
Okay.
they'll attempt to change the parents' value by asking them to speak about their issues, and it's so contrary, as you just explained. They don't
Sure.
want to do that. They don't want to talk about their issues.
Right.
So how do
So
you
let me
bridge
let
that?
me be a little bit more specific in terms of what that means. So it's not that they don't want to, but what it is that they are very reluctant to someone that they feel they can't trust, they can't open up to someone who is, as I said, outside of the house. When they are in the house, then I think they are much more willing to talk. What that means, however, is that there has to be some development prior to that. So in terms of, again, when we talk about structure, helping the families understand the value of therapy, why we do all of this, what the benefit is to them, I think that if you can give them some type of gift in that way, in the sense of understanding what it is that allows them to, like why it's important, why therapy is even something that would be reasonable or useful. So ways that it can be helpful in terms of increasing communication, increasing, again, the educational piece of it, helping their kid, if there's something, whatever the issue is going on with the child or with the family, helping them resolve that in some way. Again, giving them this sense that, yeah, this has some value, this has some merit, and being able to provide that for them. I think given that and some of that, the relationship building, then they would be more willing to talk and share and really develop in that way.
So that whole idea of inside the house, outside the house there could be a bridge there in terms of the whole relationship building then.
Absolutely. Yes, incredibly important.
Needs to be done up front then.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think you
Okay.
can really do the therapy without doing that.
Okay, thank you. And the other point of that, too, was that there was another comment pertaining to that same question, having to do with without the clinician unethically imposing their culture on their clients. So there's a fine line, then, to be managed in that process.
Right. I think, again, it's this whole sense of understanding what your preconceptions are and knowing where you're coming from as well, that I don't think it's possible not to have your values come out in therapy, because I just think we are people and it is an interpersonal process. I don't think it's possible for it to be culture-free, but it's just important to be aware of how your culture impacts the treatment, what the expectations are that you have, and how you then may temper some of those in terms of understanding the other person's culture and where they're coming from, and then being able to help either create a balance or at least help them understand where that interplay happens.
Let me ask one more follow-up question. That interaction would be easier if it were an Asian therapist, an Asian
it's a very interesting question. In fact, the answer to that question is you don't know. And the reason is we don't know is because this whole sense of acculturation plays into that. This whole sense of acculturation. If someone is if someone is traditionalist and they're really valuing the Asian culture, then maybe somebody from an Asian background might be more helpful. If someone's more assimilationist and they value the American identity, maybe they wouldn't want to see someone. So to really answer that question, it's a case-by-case answer, not necessarily a global answer.
Okay, thank you for taking time on that, but I think it's interesting. So next question is, Given the intense focus on high expectations and performance and so forth, what are your thoughts on how to help and support parents who have a child with special needs and the cultural expectations that play a part in that?
Sure. And that's really, really difficult, I think, because of what we had been talking about all evening. I think, again, it's understanding where the parent is at. So I don't know if the question is from a parent or from a clinician, but in terms of
it's from an educator.
Okay. But really allowing I think for all families, that there is this sense of loss and grief that occurs, right, when you have a child with special needs because of, again, this loss of the idealized child, this sense that this is what I wanted for my kid, this is what I wanted for my child, and now it won't be. So there is this sense of loss, and I think acknowledging that and understanding that, and I think that is fairly universal, that is not culture specific. But then couple that, so then understanding that the loss or the sense of loss for Asian Americans may even be greater because of that focus on performance. But being able to talk with, acknowledge, understand that sense of loss, and then being able to talk about it, I think is really important.
Well, getting that to happen, and is the hard part, I think.
Sure.
To find the right, but then you've got to find the right therapist, then, that's for sure.
Sure, sure.
Are there any statistics for the number of Asian Americans with TS and associated disorders? So that would mean OCD, some attention issues, anxiety and so forth, kind of that core group of disorders that accompany TS typically.
Sure. Unfortunately, I would have to get back to you on that one because I don't have those statistics readily available.
Okay.
So that's something that I can get back to whoever asked the question.
Sure, that would be great. If you could come up with anything on that,
sure,
that would be wonderful. What is the reason or the benefit to let a student or a client know that we are that we as a clinician are an expert or authority figure, as that would seem to more likely lead to a shutdown with the Asian American student or client?
I think that expectation is already there, that you are the authority. And in fact, you are the authority. So whether you're an educator or whether you're a clinician, in fact, that is true. The real question is not whether or not you're the authority, but then how do you use that power? So to help them understand that you may be the authority or the expert in your area. So you may be the expert in terms of helping them relieve their depression, for instance, if you're a therapist, or you may have skills and techniques to teach them. However, that they are, and this is, again, maybe a bit more clarification, that the student is really the expert in their own lives. The student is the expert in their experience, and that you also need their expertise in order to help you achieve anything together. And again, the sense of interdependence, right? The sense of togetherness, the sense we're going to do this together, I think is important, that you're working on it together. It's not just you pulling them along, but you need their expertise just like they need yours.
Okay. We have a couple of questions about the Tiger Mom, and they're both kind of similar. One comment is that psychologists, this individual has spoken with Asian American psychologists, and they've said that her parenting style is the key to raising neurotic kids. And then another question on that same idea, that isn't her behavior over the top and harmful? So could you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Again, this question about is her behavior the way to raise neurotic kids? Again, it depends, right? Because I think if you ask her children would say that they are actually very well adjusted, that they have done very well, and again, this sense of, the sense of practice, that I was able to really achieve something great because my mom really made me do this or forced me to do this or encouraged me to do this or strongly encouraged. So in that way, I think it's tough to have a carte blanche to say, yeah, this way of parenting is bad. And I guess that's why I brought it up, that I want to be very careful to avoid this overgeneralization that this way of doing it is completely bad for everyone. However, for most, do I think that it will fit? No. I don't think that this fits for most, and especially for those that are Asian American, because again, that whole understanding, this biculturalism, this sense of really being able to live in that middle, I think it might feel over the top for many. But I want to, again, just be careful that we're not so judgmental to say that it can't work at all or that we shouldn't do it at all or shouldn't do pieces of it. I think that there are pieces to take away from the way that she is parenting, however, with the understanding that really it is not over the top, but it is probably more than many kids can handle. And it's really about knowing the kids.
True, and yeah, and she seemed particularly lucky to have very healthy kids too.
Yes.
There are a lot of
Healthy,
people in
right,
the audience tonight that's not the case.
Agreed.
So yeah, you certainly have to know your kid, and I think she was definitely fortunate in that area. I think we have time for one more question. In terms of what you were saying about an Asian parent not complimenting their child directly, so if they compliment the child to another relative, an uncle or an aunt or whatever, does that other adult, the uncle or the aunt, share the compliment with the child? Does it ever get back to the child that your father said you were doing a great job?
Sure. I would say sometimes, and I would also say sometimes that's not enough. Right, that I would say that it can get back to the child, so their uncle might come back to them and say, hey, your dad's saying this, saying that, congratulations, whatever. But it doesn't always. And I think, again, based on the experience that I've had in terms of my own treatment of Asian American children and young adults, and in terms of the research that I've done, that it is really important, especially, again, for those Asian Americans, the ones living in the hyphen, that they have the experience of their parents telling them directly, talking to them directly, showing them directly how much they love and care about them. And that's what I would tell as a clinician to an Asian American family, especially with that difference in terms of level of acculturation. That's what I would tell the parents, that it is really important to them, that they really need to know that. They really need to feel that, even though it might feel foreign to the parents.
So that whole idea of positive reinforcement doesn't show up very often in Asian parenting then, for sure.
It shows up indirectly, correct.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note and question, we're going to wrap up tonight's presentation. Dr. Lee, thank you very much. Really great information. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you
I'm
for
going
the
to sign
opportunity.
off. Oh, you're most welcome. I'm going to sign off, and Kelly will come back on.
Okay.
Thank you for joining our webinar on mental health issues in the Asian American community. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is open now and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archive recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our website. Our next presentation, Mental Health Stigma and Help Finding Services in the African American Community, will be presented by Dr. Christine Adkins Hutchison and is scheduled for October 2014. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Good night.
Thank you.